This video is about cardiac output. Cardiac output is defined as the volume of blood that the heart pumps out in 1 minute. Now, cardiac output is calculated by multiplying the number of times that the heart beats each minute by the volume of blood that comes out with each beat. So if your heart beats 10 times in a minute, which is a ridiculously low number, and each time it pumps out 10 mils, then that means that over the course of 1 minute, 100 mils will have been pumped out by your heart. And that's the cardiac output. So if your heart beats 6 times in a minute, also ridiculous, and each time it pumps out 10 mils, then you multiply 6 times 10, and that gives you 60 mils of cardiac output. You can also see that here just by adding it. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 10 plus 10 plus 10 plus 10 plus 10 plus 10 is 60 mils. Now, these numbers are ridiculously small, but the same thing holds true when we're talking about the actual number of times that our heart beats, which is around 75 beats per minute on average, and the average volume or stroke volume, which is usually around 70 mils at rest. It follows that if our cardiac output is the product of heart rate times stroke volume, that if either heart rate or stroke volume increases, then the cardiac output will also increase, right? So if our heart beats faster, more times per minute, or it pumps out a greater volume, that's going to increase our cardiac output. If heart rate or stroke volume decrease, so our heart is slower, not beating as many times per minute, or is pumping out less, then of course the overall cardiac output will decrease. Now, let's look at heart rate first and the things that affect that. Now, as you know, the heart actually initiates each beat from within, starting at the SA node or AV or ventricular myocytes if the SA node is knocked out. But it is influenced by the cardiac center of the medulla oblongata. So here's the medulla oblongata. And what that means is that medulla oblongata says, hey, speed up, or hey, slow down, depending on the circumstances. Now, things that cause the medulla oblongata to change the heart rate include information from proprioceptors. Proprioceptors are receptors that are sort of wound around the skeletal muscle fibers. So we have these super long skeletal muscle fibers, and proprioceptors are sort of wound around that. When that skeletal muscle fiber contracts, it gets shorter and fatter. That causes the proprioceptor to send a signal, says, hey, the muscle's moving. And when the muscle fiber relaxes, gets longer and thinner, then that signal stops. So proprioceptors are a way to alert the brain, the medulla oblongata, to the fact that we are moving. And if we're moving, we probably need more blood delivered to be able to support that. We also get information from higher brain centers. So things that cause an emotional response, like, oh, by the way, there's an exam tomorrow that covers everything you've ever studied. Or something that, imagining, for instance, relaxing on the beach, which can cause your heart rate to go down. These things are coming from higher brain centers and are influencing the heart rate that the medulla oblongata is saying to maintain. And by the way, from the medulla oblongata, we have the vagus nerve coming out from there, and the vagus is always telling the heart rate to slow down. The SA node on its own wants to start a heartbeat about 100 times a minute, but our average heart rate is 75, and that's because the vagus nerve, or the cardioinhibitory center, the one that slows the heart rate, is saying, hey, you know what? We really don't need this much blood circulating. Let's save our energy in case we have an emergency. Chemicals can affect heart rate as well. Two very common ones are caffeine and nicotine, and together they really increase the heart rate. And of course, there are chemicals, other drugs, some legal, some not legal, that will also increase the heart rate. Finally, potassium has a huge impact on heart rate. And if we look at the red here is what a normal membrane action potential looks like in the SA node, right? So we've got the drift towards the threshold, depolarization, repolarization, and then we start all over. If there is too much potassium in the blood, then what happens is that we drift. Now we're looking at the green. We drift towards the threshold, we depolarize, but it takes a lot longer to repolarize. We drift, we depolarize, but it takes a lot longer. So now the heartbeats are more spread out, or the heart rate slows. Having not enough potassium in the blood actually causes the SA node to repolarize too much. It hyperpolarizes. So it's starting from a more negative number, which means it takes a lot longer to reach the threshold. We depolarize, we repolarize, but we start back down here and it takes a lot longer to reach the threshold. So, regardless of whether potassium's too high or too low, it causes the heart rate to slow. And in fact, this is actually in states that use lethal injection to as capital punishment to kill people when there's the death penalty. They give a cocktail of drugs. One is a calming one, one is numbing, and the third, the thing that actually kills the person, is potassium, because it has that big of an effect on heart rate. Now, let's look at stroke volume. Stroke volume is affected by three things. The first is preload. Preload affects stroke volume in a good way, meaning when preload goes up, stroke volume goes up. Contractility also increases stroke volume, so it affects it in a good way. Contractility goes up, stroke volume goes up. Afterload, the third thing that affects stroke volume, is not desirable. When afterload goes up, stroke volume goes down. All right, let's look at each one of these by itself. Preload is defined as the amount of stretch in the ventricles before contraction. So what causes stretch in the ventricles is the blood that's coming into the ventricles. And the ventricles are not designed to hold or store blood. So what goes into the ventricles must come out. So when there is more blood in the ventricles, say because you're exercising and those skeletal muscles are squeezing blood and it's coming back to the heart in a higher volume than normal, that's going to cause the ventricles to stretch a little more. And anytime you stretch a muscle, especially a sudden stretch, it will have a reflex contraction on top of any contraction that you're stimulating it to do with a nerve signal, for instance. So more stretch is going to give us a stronger reflex contraction on top of the contraction that's being stimulated by the SA node. And that's going to cause the ventricle to generate higher pressure. So now there's a bigger difference between the pressure in the ventricles and the pressure in the arteries that we're trying to eject the blood to. And that means that more blood will be ejected. And this increases the stroke volume. It's a little bit like stretching a bow to shoot an arrow. If this is normal, this is how we normally stretch the bowstring in order to shoot the arrow, this arrow is going to go a certain distance. But if we stretch the bowstring or the ventricles a little bit more, then that's going to generate more force and the arrow will go further. So that's preload. Contractility, in a lot of ways, is more straightforward. Ultimately, contractility is about the amount of calcium that is inside the myocytes. The more calcium that's there, the more troponin tells tropomyosin to move out of the way, which means more of the thick and thin filaments can be involved in the contraction and generate more pressure. But basically, contractility is the strength at a given preload. So we're not changing the volume of blood in the ventricles, but sometimes, because there's more calcium there, the ventricles can squeeze harder than other times. Contractility is generally used as a way to boost performance, to increase stroke volume when there's need. Maybe it's to overcome a difficulty, or maybe it's to help you exercise, to increase the stroke volume because you're exercising. All right, afterload is the one we don't want. So afterload is defined as the resistance that the ventricles have to push against in order to eject the blood. Now, if we look, here's a micrograph of an artery, a healthy one, right? So we've got all this space here for blood to go through. But sometimes our arteries get clogged. So there's a buildup of cholesterol and other things in the artery wall, and therefore the space that we have for blood to go through is smaller. Now imagine that you're the ventricle contracting, and if you have an artery like this that you're pushing the blood into, then you can say, I'm just going to pick a random number, let's say you can get out 100 mils in the time that you're contracting. But if you're having to push that blood into a tiny hole like this, then unless you change how hard you're contracting, which you're not allowed to do yet, you're going to get less blood out. You just can't fit as much in that small space. So if your blood pressure is high in the great arteries, meaning that the difference between the pressure in the ventricles and the arteries is not as great, it's not as steep, or if the vessels are narrowed, anything that makes it harder for the blood to get out is increased afterload. And if afterload increases, then stroke volume decreases. Now, let's talk about what happens to cardiac output with exercise. So we can think of exercise as having short-term effects on our cardiac output and also long-term effects. We're going to look at short-term first. As soon as you begin to exercise, the muscle movement causes the proprioceptors to signal the cardiac center in the medulla oblongata, and heart rate increases. In other words, as soon as you start moving, there's a signal to the brain that says, hey, she's starting to exercise. We might want to move this thing along so that we have enough blood and oxygen to be delivered. Muscle contraction in the legs especially, and this is something that you'll see in more detail in the topic on vessels. The leg muscles, when they contract, they get shorter and fatter. They squeeze on the veins in the leg, and that helps to push the blood back to the heart. It increases what we call venous return, VR. And so if there's more blood being pushed back to the heart and arriving at the heart, that increases preload. That stretches our ventricles more, which means that we're going to have a stronger contraction and greater stroke volume. So we get an increase in heart rate from the proprioceptors, signaling the cardiac center, and we get an increase in stroke volume because the leg muscles are pushing the blood back to the heart. So that happens every time you exercise. Now, if we look at long-term adjustments to exercise, if we compare what's going on in the body of, say, a trained athlete and someone that's not a trained athlete, with training, the heart actually becomes larger and stronger, just like any other muscle. The more work you ask it to do, the stronger it becomes in order to do that work. And because the heart, or the ventricles in particular, are stronger, they are able to pump more blood with each beat. That means the stroke volume is higher, even at rest, right? The heart's so strong it can't help but pump out more blood each time, even if you're not exercising. And so, what that means is that even at rest, an athlete's heart rate is lower than a non athlete because at rest, both individuals will have the same cardiac output need. In other words, they both need to circulate, let's say, 5 liters in a minute. But because the athlete's heart is able to pump out more blood each time, it doesn't have to beat as many times to reach that 5 liters. Let's look at it this way. Our non athlete, and these numbers again are bogus, our non athlete has to pump or their heart has to beat 6 times, and each time it pumps out 10 mils of blood. So we've got 60 mils of blood in this unit of time. But our athlete, because their heart is stronger, they can pump out 20 mils of blood each time. That means that they only have to have 3 heartbeats. 3 times 20 is 60 to get to the same volume of blood. And this is why the long-term adaptation to exercise, one of them, is that the heart rate in general is slower. It's just getting stronger and better at its job.